rich until the pips squeak, slash public spending to pay for astronomical debt. It feels like history in reverse today, circa old Labour 1976, as a new Labour government is forced back into the nightmare formula it has battled so long for so hard to expunge. Today's budget speech was the grimmest in memory, a 10-year-long party of low taxes, high spending. Today, Mr. Darling unveiled a fiscal hangover that will last for decades. National debt will soar to a record £175 billion this year alone. That's more than since the World War II. And the economy will shrink by 3.5%, its biggest dip in 60 years. To help pay for it, a raid on the rich, the tax rate will increase to 50% for those earning £150,000 or more from next year. Motorists will be hit as usual as fuel duty goes up by 2 pence a litre. Similarly, alcohol duties go up by 2%, putting 1 pence on a pint. Along with tobacco duties up by the same, putting 1 pence on a pint of beer, 7 pence to a packet of 20 cigarettes. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
The election starts here. To sharpen the political battle lines, there was a squeeze the super-rich new rate of tax. But a new era of economics and politics starts here too. The government had to announce record peacetime levels of borrowing, eye-watering debt.
Our own figures for public sector net borrowing will be £175 billion this year, or some 12% of GDP.
Gordon Brown's fingerprints were all over the tax measures. It's a breach of a manifesto pledge, a breach of one of Tony Blair's articles of faith. Gordon Brown believes he had to raise the money and that he can cast the Tories as friends of the rich if they fail to back the measures.
In November, I announced a new rate of income tax of 45% on incomes above £150,000. That's the top 1% of taxpayers. In order to help pay for additional support for people now and to invest in the future, I've decided that the new rate will be 50% and will come in from April next year, a year earlier.
The Chancellor said it was time to hit those who'd enjoyed the economic good times. The Treasury claims it can pull in £7 billion by raising taxes on those above £100,000 a year and £150,000 a year. The measures include a new 50% tax rate for those on over 150, a cut in pension relief for the same group. The Tories aren't saying yet whether they'd back these tax hikes, though they say they're against higher tax rates in principle and doubt they'd raise anything like the figures the Treasury expect. The Conservatives hired a pavement artist to make their point in front of the Treasury. David Cameron wanted to focus on government debt.
This Prime Minister has certainly got himself in the history books. He has written a whole chapter in red ink, Labour's decade of debt. The Chancellor rattled through those figures for borrowing, so let me read them slowly. The government is set to borrow £175 billion this year, followed by £173 billion, then £140. You say you said it, you swallowed it. And then £118 billion. That means that over a 4-year period, Britain will now be borrowing £606 billion. They talk about child poverty. With debt like that, our children are going to be in poverty for decades.
The Prime Minister joined the Chancellor this morning visiting an apprentice scheme in North London. On top of the eye-catching new 50p tax rate, there was a blizzard of initiatives, including guaranteed work or training for all under 25s in long-term unemployment. The government is cutting back the rate of public spending growth. It is still penciling in rises of 0.7% and hoping the Conservatives will declare themselves in favour of full-blown real public spending cuts ahead of the general election. In the swirl of figures coming out of the Treasury today, Gordon Brown would like you to focus on this one, the £5 billion worth of targeted measures to help out in areas like jobs and housing. It's a net giveaway by the Treasury. Unfortunately for him, it's extremely hard to take your eyes off this figure, the £175 billion worth of borrowing planned for the coming year. This, though, could prove to be of historic significance because it's a net giveaway, a fiscal loosening. And because of the costs of paying back this sort of level of borrowing, it'll probably be many, many years before you see any sort of net giveaway by a government again. The Chancellor breakfasted this morning with his wife and his parliamentary aide and a few cameras. With plummeting tax revenues, he had to answer the question how he'd fill the black hole. There are savings in Whitehall budgets and tax hikes. But the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats say Alistair Darling's managed to make his sums add up by assuming a growth forecast that is wildly optimistic.
I mean, what they've done is a kind of reverse engineering. They've got this enormous deficit, they've worked out what kind of growth would be needed to reduce it, and they've just made that up. And what is dishonest about it is that if we are going to confront the budget deficit, all parties have got to look hard at public spending priorities and make some very tough choices.
As of today, any claim they have ever made to economic competence is dead, over, finished.
The public sector finances revealed today are truly gruesome. For years, Gordon Brown proclaimed the public sector debt should not go above 40% of GDP, national economic output. Today's budget shows that figure going to 80%. And nobody has a clue when it'll get back below 40%. It could be decades away. All this means that Britain today entered a new era, an era of public sector squeezes and tax hikes, whoever wins the next general election. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
So a truly terrible outlook for the British economy and the public finances, but it could be even worse. The Treasury's forecasts have been often over-optimistic. As our economics correspondent Faisal Islam reports, the latest assessment of UK PLC from the IMF is even worse.
The party's over. After 10 years of debt-fueled boom, the bust returns. This far from a vintage year for Mr Darling. Rather, the Chancellor's been forced to unveil the worst collapse in public finances since the 40s. The reason? The economy's plunging into the worst recession in more than 6 decades. Output will shrink by 3.5% this year. Mr Darling says the recession will then end and a modest recovery of 1.25% next year, before boom times kick in again and the economy rebounds back with growth of 3.5% in 2011, a rate last seen in the dot-com boom. That performance is key to making the budget numbers work. But the forecasts were flatly contradicted by the IMF today, which believes the recession will continue next year. Business leaders too think that life for Mr Darling will be far tougher.
He's saying that if everything goes okay, if the economy grows faster than most people, apart from him, think it's going to do over the next few years, if he manages to control public spending much more rigorously than they have been controlled over the last 10 years, if everything goes absolutely swimmingly, then by 2018, that's two parliaments away, the budget will be back in balance. That seems a long time.
As the CBI was saying, the economic collapse means a tax revenue collapse and a spending freeze, a nasty aftertaste for borrowing too. In the budget just a year ago, Mr Darling thought he'd borrow these amounts over the next 4 years, £38 billion and falling. Here's the